Ta-da. Great. All right, guys. So welcome to the January, can you believe it's 2025 already? 2025 book club meeting for this month. And is anybody new with us this time? Nope. Okay. No raising of hands. This month, we read a book that I had looked at really heavily last summer, and I was had read it and or read through it, and I was kind of like doing my little skim thing and deciding whether I was going to do it or not. And then Christine read it at the top corner here, and she said she loved it. So I said, okay, I mean, it's a little on the edge of what I thought you guys might like. So we did it, and it's Rednecks by Taylor Brown. I've reached out to Taylor Brown about 12 times, and his PR people got back to me. They're no longer his PR people, so he never got back to us, which is fine. I really would have loved to had him on to talk to him about this book. But this is what we read this month. And before we get started, I just wanted to sort of, and I usually don't do this, ask you guys a bit about your impressions before I give you sort of mine on this. So just sort of, if anybody wants to sort of just volunteer, this is different than the books we've read in the past in my mind. It was very close to nonfiction in a lot of ways. But also I think, his expository writing style is a lot different than what we're used to as well. We can talk about that as we go. But I would be interested in getting your first impressions before we dive into some of the nuances of the story. Janet, you got your hand up.
Okay. Yeah, I really liked the book. I thought his writing was great. Um, it was very depressing to read. It reminded me somewhat of a little lighter version of The Jungle, which took me months to get through because it was so depressing. And it's just a horrible thought that this really happened, and it may happen again. So let's hear it for robber barons. Um, yeah, I loved Sid Hatfield's character, and I guess my only question is, was he a Hatfield of the Hatfield McCoys, and did
Yes.
that have something to do with
It was
his
after his generation. The Hatfields and Hatfields and
before?
McCoys was earlier than his generation,
Okay,
but yes, it was his family. I think it was his uncle in particular that they were talking
right.
about.
I
Yes.
think I remember hearing something like that in the story, but
Yeah.
wasn't quite sure because they never really brought up anything about the McCoys or anything like that. But yeah, it was very, very sad when they took him down on the courthouse steps. It's like, wow.
Right. I had a
So,
hard time believing some of this to be
oh,
real when in fact we know it was, right? I mean, what's so shocking about the story
yeah.
was how true to the facts that he apparently stayed. Okay, Michelle.
Hi guys. For me, the beginning of the book, I would say the first 30%, it was really convoluted. And I'm like, wow, this is going to be hard to read. But then I started to fall in love with his writing technique and the way he described things. And you could feel the emotions, you could see the people. It just, I took pictures of a few passages. I don't have them with me right now, but like page 223, I wrote where Beulah talks about her passing into the kingdom. That was very emotional to me, and it was really good. Um, there was an article that was written, oh my gosh, when was that? August 3rd, 1921, and where they wrote about what happened, and it wasn't at all what really happened. And it's just crazy how that still occurs today. So I really liked the book.
Right. Thanks, Michelle.
Yeah.
Eileen.
Yeah, I have to disagree with Michelle. I didn't care for this book. I didn't care for his writing style mainly. I thought there were way too many metaphors, metaphor. I was like, oh, stop, 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 enough. But I also felt that the ending was really weak. And if I'm remembering correctly, I think he explained a lot of things in the author's notes that I felt should have been in the book.
Exactly. I was waiting for one of you authors, either you or Diane, to get to that. Um, um, and that was so. So I was that one of the reasons I think, and I'm just going to go there. I on Eileen's note that I toyed with whether or not to bring this one in or not. I thought the story was so compelling, but I am in 100% agreement with Eileen on his writing style. And Diane, I'm going to get your input on this as well. A lot of expository language, where he's telling us, and I wanted more showing. And I felt in doing that, it was repetitive and in a lot of places, and the writing was dense, really dense, which I think, to Michelle's point, made it harder to read through, to get through. I think he could have lightened it up a little bit. And we're going to talk about the ending, Eileen, because you were 100%, my opinion, right on this. I mean, I shouldn't have to read the author's notes to find out how a story ends. I think he could have cut some stuff, and we'll talk about what I think he should have cut. But I think he could have ended this book. I think Blizzard should have been more of a character earlier on in the story. And I think the book should have ended with that trial, of Blizzard being acquitted in that trial in Charleston or wherever it was. And with Musa, or the young boy, taking the whoever to get the bomb out of wherever they hid it, and that being shown in the courtroom. I think that would have been a fabulous ending, to the story, and then an epilogue of where they're reading in the paper, you know, 20 years or 10 years later, when finally the laws get enacted where you're allowed to unionize, and no one can threaten that activity in the States. I felt he missed a huge opportunity by not doing that, and that's we'll talk about that. Diane, I'm interested in your comments, but I agree with Eileen on some of that right there.
Yeah. Well, I had, there are parts I liked about it and parts I didn't. The part I didn't was that it seemed to be at the same speed the whole time. It was like this unremitting level of violence that just kept going on and on and on. When you look up the story of Blair Mountain, that is what happened, and it is confusing, but it didn't translate well into the book, you know. I like the characters. I thought the characters were interesting and compelling. Um, my biggest complaint is I'm from southwestern Ohio, and my grandmother was from the mountains of eastern Kentucky, and most of my aunts and uncles were from eastern Kentucky. And they have a way of speaking that is totally unlike, in my opinion, the language he used in the book. And I thought, you know, if he were here, I would be curious as to why he chose that voice. And I know he's from Georgia, I think, and it's different, you know, and the language that the mountain people use is very colorful and kind of quavery and has a lot of its own juice that he seemed to be making up his own poetic kind of language, you know, and it was lyrical, but it wasn't accurate, and that put me off. So,
Interesting. I mean, I noticed, one of the things that people from the hills do, is that there's a lot of verbs in the
mhm.
sentences. I done and went and got me a something. You know what I'm saying? I mean, a lot of verbs, and so
Yeah,
that was
I'm
missing.
fixing to do this. Yeah.
Yeah, fixing and going for a piece, and you know those kinds of things. We're missing, from the colloquial sort of dialogue. But I was interested in if you caught on the end too, if you had sort of who else besides me and Eileen had that problem with the ending, figuring out what actually happened in the author's notes as opposed to in the body of the
Well,
book. I see Kristen raising
well,
her hand.
yeah, you felt kind of cheated, you know, that you had to read it there,
Hmm.
and that that he couldn't have put it in the book.
Yeah. So those were two strikes I had. I mean, in terms of things that I had issue with. But what I enjoyed a lot of this was the depth of the characters. I mean, he took on a lot of characters, and you know, and we're going to talk about the characters in a minute. I got a poll. You guys love my polls. In terms of the depth of those characters, you really understood. I could see and feel, and relate to, Miss Beulah, and to Dr. Moo, and to Sid, and to Frank. I mean, that's pretty unusual. I mean, you know what I'm saying? To really be able to relate to that number of characters. I had a hard time in the beginning trying to figure out who the protagonist was. Now I knew it was Moo because it starts with Moo, but if you didn't have that sort of, experience in reading and writing, it would be difficult in my mind to figure out who that main character was. Miriam.
So I'm going to admit that I didn't particularly care for the book, but that's okay. Part of it was the dialect, and writing in dialect. I just find that it makes it harder to relate to the book. Um, and it does not sound like, since I've lived in Ohio for 30 years, it does not sound like the Ohioans who are from Southeast Ohio. Um, my complaint as a librarian was there's one page of bibliography and one page of significant quotes in a book this long. That's a disservice. There should have been a longer bibliography. If he's really writing it more as a journalistic type of a fictional novel, he needed many more citations. I want to know where he got the information from. And so that to me tells me that he's missing another audience. He's missing the audience that might be really interested in learning more about the coal mine strikes.
But but Dr. Moo, in things that I've read about this book, Dr. Moo was fashioned around his grandfather. So he might not have needed such a large bibliography because he could have been receiving the information like people used to receive the Bible. You know what I mean?
Well, but you
Just
still
steeping it in
need,
folklore.
if you're, I'm sorry, in a book this long and you've only got a page, less than a page of quote citations.
So what you're saying is that he probably shouldn't have done it at all in terms of a quote
Either
citation or a
he shouldn't have
bibliography,
included it at all,
if it's fiction.
or even if it's fiction, or it should have been more extensive. And I've seen plenty when it's fiction, but I don't know. There were a lot of characters. I wasn't sure who the characters were. I wasn't sure I cared about the characters. So I think in the end, I just kind of, I mean, I read it, but it wasn't something, it was very much written for a guy, a male audience, which I also thought was very interesting.
All right,
So
where's Donald and where's what's his
there's a
name?
couple of guys here today.
Malcolm, are you on?
I also thought that was interesting. The violence, the extent of the violence is definitely much towards a male audience. This was not.
Oh, my husband loved this book. And he
I
doesn't
didn't
really-
feel like I could relate to any of the characters in this book.
Oh, well, I know when I had it out here, my husband's like, I gotta read this. I was like, okay, he just saw I guess the redneck part of it.
Maybe.
Donald, what's your impression from a guy's perspective?
Well,
I
I liked it just because my family's from that area, and my grandfather and uncles were coal miners and were involved in a strike in like late 89, 90. So it was interesting to me. My grandfather was probably a coal miner a little bit later than that time frame. So it was an interest to me. It was a heavier read for me. Not used to that style of writing as well. I just finished today about 3 o'clock. But yeah, no, I did relate to the characters. Was a heavier read. I didn't necessarily find it overly violent. Some parts maybe, but no, I did enjoy the book overall. I did enjoy the character development. But yeah, overall, I did enjoy the book. I did find, interestingly enough, I did find the dialect, the accent to be pretty much on point for that area. Just FYI to the others that disagree.
Okay. Carol, thanks.
Hi, I just have a real Happy New Year, everybody. And I just have a really short, because I listened to the book.
Interesting. I was going to ask somebody if they did that. Yeah.
And I got very, very excited at the beginning because I remember back, I'm actually giving away how old I am, but I remember back in the 60s and 70s when I used to babysit, and one of my favorite movies was The Hatfields and McCoys with Farley Granger. And it's like a very classic movie. And then again, Harrison Ford. No, not Harrison Ford. What's his name?
Kevin
Costner did a series on the Hatfields and the McCoys, and I found their story to be absolutely fascinating. And as you know, I'm a big Eleanor Roosevelt enthusiast, and she was down in the coal mines with the miners in the late 1920s, early 1930s, it was a really big issue for her, a big, emphasis for her. So their plight has been, and then of course there's Poldark, that's all about mining and the miners, and that takes place in the 1700s. But just the topics of it, and I love westerns, and I love those kinds of things, and the violence I don't mind, but it was when everybody's saying graphic, it was so graphic, and listening to it was really tough because it was the constant and the dialect too. It came, I kept trying to turn it back on. And ironically, I was at the same time listening to a book, which I highly recommend, called Finding Dorothy. And it's about Maud Baum, who was Frank Baum's wife, the one who wrote The Wizard of Oz. And it's a fiction, but it's amazing. And it's about her mother, Matilda, who was one of Cady Stanton and, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony's cohorts. So I'm listening to these two at the same time. And I did get into the characters, but it just was really hard. I wish the author could have come, because I don't even know, I didn't get to finish the whole book. I have to go and remember, listen to the rest of it to make sure there is an author's note, because sometimes audios don't have an author's note.
I know. That's what I was going to ask, if anybody listened to it.
And then
all
you'd
the way
really
through.
be lost at the end. That's all.
Yeah, and that's what I was curious. Did anybody else listen to it? And was the author note at the end on the Nancy or Kathy? So it was. So you did get the roll up at the end with the author's note. Okay, good, because that would be that would be a disappointment, because that was a big problem I had with thinking about it. Way it ended like that. Like I said, I was torn, but Christine loved it and my husband loved it, and I enjoyed it from the perspective of I learned so much about that period, and I fell in love with these characters. And so with that, I want to, if I can find it, I want to kind of ask you guys, and I even have an answer for you, Miriam, on this poll, if you can believe it. I'm going to launch a who is your, can you guys see it? Which character was your favorite? So everybody gets to pick one. Can you guys see it? Yep. Okay, things are coming in. And I don't get to vote, so it's no fair. See, Miriam's already got her answer. And Miss B is Miss Beulah, in case you're wondering.
Sometimes I don't mind if none of the characters are relatable or nice people or whatever. I just had a hard time with this book. I just found it very depressing. It's also, I live in a place where it's gray all the time in the winter. It's really hard for me to read a depressing book because it's so gray here. But
we're going to get you some happier books going forward, I promise.
Okay.
All right. Is everybody done? Okay, I'm going to share the end of the poll, and it's interesting. So, Dr. Moo, obviously, most of you felt he was obviously the protagonist, but it took me a bit. I'll tell you. I was thinking it was going to be Sid that was going to end up being the protagonist of the story, even though it started with Dr. Moo. I kind of had a feeling it was going to be him, especially with the way Mother Jones came in and said, basically, she anointed him. You're the guy that's going to run this. So, let me get a session. Someone who said that Miss Beulah was their favorite character. Kind of give me a sense of why you felt that way, what she meant to you. Let me stop sharing since you guys can't do anything without that. Okay, good. So anybody who was Christine?
I just thought she was sort of the moral compass of the story, because it was a hard story. It definitely was. What I liked about it was that I learned something I had never even known about our own country. But I felt like, Beulah was our, she was the caretaker. She was just the heart of this story. When you needed a little break from the violence, we had her giving us wise counsel, and just
Interesting observation, because when I was talking with this earlier about the story with my husband, one of the things that he commented on is that, she's the one that gave sort of that strength to Frank and made him who he was. She was the one that kept Dr. Moo, engaged with the camp and, keeping his spirit as well. And even the young boy, she had an impact on him as well. So I agree. She was kind of like the sort of the center of a whole bunch of spokes and sort of kept people together and moving. And to lose her, was sort of a sad way to go, but we knew that was going to come. What about Sid? I was a big Sid fan. Who else was a big Sid fan? Somebody's got to
Well,
speak
I
up.
liked Sid's character, but he wasn't like my favorite
Right.
overall. Yeah. So that was like, okay, I was kind of like, okay, but Sid only was there for part of the book, and Dr. Moo kind of like had to carry on. So that was
But
nice.
he was the turning point. That killing of Sid. Now, Sid wasn't like, um, the most, moral, ethically straight guy. I mean, he's shooting people first and, invoking a lot of this violence as well. However, his death, and the way that was orchestrated was the turning point, which was like, it was the spark that set off this powder keg, of the situation. And so he played a really important role, almost like that sacrificial lamb, that sort of set the wheels in motion that we saw. But I liked his character, and he was based on a real person, which I thought was, obviously very interesting as well. And then we had Frank. And anybody want to talk about Frank? Big Frank? Thoughts on Big Frank? Big Frank was forged, but that was another turning point in my mind, for his character and his arc when he was beaten like that in that jail and survived it. And it was interesting how she pushed on the faith part of this, but not so hard that it was overwhelming. It wasn't one of those books you go, okay, this is a real religious book, but it did have that sort of impact of, him finding his faith and his inner strength and, becoming stronger as a result of that. I felt that he was what I'm going to call is one of those unresolved contracts. And so Diane and Eileen know what I'm talking about in particular. When you write, you make a contract with the reader when you create a character or you set a scene in motion. And usually an author does not leave those contracts or those things, those chads dangling, those contracts unresolved. And in this case, I felt a little disappointed that we don't know what really happened to Frank. We don't really know what Crockett said to Frank. I felt that I was disappointed by that. Or at least we didn't have Frank in his own mind thinking what he must have what he said to them or what he meant for him to do. There was no revelation of, okay, Crockett must have meant this and this is what I'm going to go do. I sort of felt robbed by that. Anybody else sort of felt that way besides me on Frank? Where'd he go? What happened to him? Where'd he end up?
I think there was an awful lot of that in this book. An
Mm.
awful lot of just things that were left hanging, and you never really came to resolutions for a lot of the characters, which was another thing that I didn't care for in the book.
Yeah, that was a disappointment for me. And then I guess finally Mother Jones. Two of you like Mother Jones. Yes, Carol, go on about her because I have another thought on her. Go ahead.
Okay, first I want to show you guys a photo of her.
Mm.
And she wrote her own autobiography, and it was introduced by Clarence Darrow, the famous um, lawyer. So
Mhm.
she was like a powerhouse. And I wish that I had read more about her as a sidebar. I'm going to be looking her up even more now because I guess she worked until she was 93. And she was a Catholic. And at age 60, she started organizing miners in the labor. I mean, like
Right.
these these kinds of women are like very important.
But what's
And
interesting, yeah,
I
I
like
liked,
the fact that it was someone real, that it was a real person.
and I'm glad, in some ways, I'm glad that he incorporated that real person into this story. But in other ways, I found her to be a distraction, at least for me. I think he could have. I honestly, this Blizzard character kind of shows up toward the end, I guess, the last half of the book, and ends up being the guy that goes to trial. I would have, in my world, I would have merged her with him, and brought him through the book and had him end it with that trial. That's how I would have developed it. I felt a lot of the chapters with her was a bit of a distraction from the.
Mhm.
Maybe that was maybe that was his way, Eileen, or Diana. Diana, I think it was more your comment of giving us that sort of, Alfred Hitchcock relief. You build up with some violence and then you come down to her and then you build up again. Maybe that was his way of sort of, bringing down the tension in the story. I just found her to be a bit distracting. Maybe it was because she wasn't integrated into the story all along. I'm not quite sure. Kristen, yes.
I thought she was probably there just to show that she was the only person that seemed to have anybody's ear that was, out of that bubble of violence and everything. And that even she could not get anything moving in a way that really impacted things. I felt like that was her only purpose in the whole thing. And that he gave that background a little bit of her just to say why she was so passionate and why she was willing to advocate for them.
Okay. I just think there's a lot of real estate. So, for example, there was one chapter, if you guys remember this, where she is walking down the street in Washington, D.C. to go to the War Secretary's office. And it's like 4 or 5 pages of her walking down the street to get to the War Office. And it's all in her head, talking about, thinking about whatever. And then she ends up she's on her way to the War Secretary's office, and then she gets there 5 pages later. I was like, I'm sorry, maybe I'm low on patience. I'm like, come on, like, let's move on here a little bit. So I wonder if, he could have kept that role, but maybe not have, belabored it as much.
This was another one of those things that I felt like editing was weird and uneven in this book. And I don't know if that was an editing call where he had just made that a long time and it just was in there. But there were other things that I was like, I'm
And I think you're right
interested
on the
that
editing,
that got to stay in there.
the repetitiveness too of some of the stuff. I was like, okay, a lot of repetitiveness. Yes, Diane.
Well, I just think she was so colorful that he had to include her and that he used her as a foil for all the men. She was like the only like strong woman in some ways, although Beulah was strong in her own way. So he just couldn't resist her and put too much of her stuff in. That's how
Yeah,
she,
I see. I see. She was very colorful.
yeah,
And she
she's a
did
cool
play a
character.
role, and you're right, Kristen, in that regards of, that tie to Washington, D.C. and getting the reporters there. That's another thing. I wish the reporters had been involved more along too, I guess, made it more of a
I,
story.
yeah, I almost feel like the whole book, he felt like he had to put all the main players in, that somehow he had to report all that stuff, and it was more than the book needed to have, you know?
Mhm. I agree. Miriam,
So I guess I have a dumb question.
no
Who
questions, a
is
dumb question.
why the narrator is a third person? So who is the narrator? Can somebody answer that? I mean, whose point of view are we getting? Because somebody's telling the story right from the beginning and it's told in the third person all along.
Hmm.
Well, I think it's from the
And that's
head.
like a Carol question. Sorry.
But that's the head that he's in, right? He's in. So in the first chapter, he's in Moo's head, and then he drifts to Sid's head. But what he does, and I noticed this, and I'm sure others might have noticed it too, he head hops, where he'll be in the middle of a paragraph, and all of a sudden you got the perspective of, if he's talking about Dr. Moo, all of a sudden you get the perspective of his son, or there's a head hopping going on, and that's what you're talking about. That's why you're confused. But in the narrations, it's third person omniscient up here someplace, who's in heads and jumping around. That's a little rough.
For a long time, I was thinking it was his son, but then I noticed, wait a minute, that's not his point, he wouldn't know that. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it was just an omniscient narrator.
Hmm.
And which is I'm amazed that they published a book like that because that's really fallen out of favor. The omniscient narrator.
Right. You're either in whoever's chapter you're writing, you're in that particular person's head as opposed to jumping around the way he had done so. And you're right. That's a John Steinbeck way of writing. They don't let us get away with that anymore in the publishing world.
No,
Usually.
and it really, even there was no chapter that was actually from one person's point of view. It constantly just went back and forth. So I just assumed it was omniscient, but I really think the book could have been cut in half and have been a much better book.
I wonder if he did that on purpose because it seemed there was so much chaos in the book. It was just chaotic.
You mean in
That
the actual story itself, not the book, but the
Yeah, in the
story. Yeah, yeah.
story and even in the writing and in the character development, there was just so much chaos. And in
Mm.
the situation in history, who knows? Maybe he was being stylistic. It would have been great to have him here to ask him those kind of questions.
Y'all have to be nice then.
I'm gonna have to send him some emails. I know.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
Michelle?
Oh, I just wanted to make a comment. I forgot what it's called, but where he brought in the meaning of rednecks and the meaning of the red bandana, and how it represented the throat being cut. I thought that was really neat.
Yeah, I like that symbolism as well. In terms of we just don't view it that way. I mean, I always thought it was because
Right,
of the boys had their t-shirts on and just where they got, the sun on the
right,
backs of their necks, but that had
right.
nothing to do with it. Um, that was one of my questions in general. Other significant or other pieces of information that you guys that were profound that you picked up on that you learned that you didn't know before that sort of you'll take away from the story, like that example of the bandana and the redneck itself. Did anybody else have anything that sort of just struck them? I have a list of things that kind of stood out to me. Um, Christine, anybody? Kristen?
I have like said this like 3 times since starting to read this book about how they wanted to get the hats for the mules, but not for the men. That
Right?
was astounding because they could just hire another man, but the mules were expensive to replace.
Right. Um, the conditions in these mines. I mean, I kept in my head on that note thinking about how you would work all day, 10 hours a day in a 3 foot high shaft. If that's really, I mean, 3 feet high. I mean,
Mhm.
that's crawling. I mean, I don't even know how that works. It's horrendous to even think about. Diane?
Um, yeah, the part that horrified me was the fact that we bombed fellow Americans. That was hard to ignore. And as far as squatting down in those low ceilings, uh, I had a person that worked for me from Wise County down in the tippy tip
Virginia?
of Virginia, and he had photographs of his brother working in those conditions, just all hunched over, 4 feet, rock on the top, rock on the bottom. It wasn't at all what I thought working in a mine was like. It's terrible.
I'm just claustrophobic thinking about it. I mean, it's just horrendous. I can't imagine. And so that was poignant to me. When you mentioned the bombs, Americans dropping bombs on Americans and with screws and nuts and bolts and stuff, just the shrapnel that they threw in there, just, that was all real things. And that's horrifying to me that we could actually do that. I mean, we could do that to one another. I have a whole different way of thinking about Pinkerton men, Baldwin lock companies. I mean, I just have a whole different perspective now, just thinking about this book and that.
And
Janet,
even the
Yeah, the other
brutality.
thing that really, really bothered me was just how brutally horrible those people were. The ones that were like gonna get those miners at any cost, whether it's bombing or whatever they had to do, they were gonna blow them to pieces. And it was like, wow, I mean, I'm just hearing it echoing right now, today, what is happening all over again. And yet, this was like over 100 years ago. So That part was just like gut wrenching for me to kept because like you said, he kept repeating, and it was just so repetitive for them to say, well, if they're coming, we're gonna get them. We're gonna get them no matter what. We got the feds. The president says we can do it. Oh my God. Yeah. Well, as
But
long as the
even
president says they can do it.
even the brutality of, what they were doing to the families, like, pulling Beulah out of her home. I mean, she had lived there forever. I don't, that stuff struck me. So.
Yeah. Michelle?
I just had a question. When it got to the part with Miss Beulah sitting in her chair and the hound came over, for a little while there, I was thinking that maybe it wasn't a hound, it was maybe a bear, and that was going to be her demise. But was there any symbolism with the hound?
The dog, you mean?
Yeah,
Yeah.
the dog.
Do you guys have some thoughts on that? In terms of that dog that had come over. I have some thoughts on it, but I wonder if you guys had any thoughts on what that dog meant.
Yeah, I
I,
don't, but
I
I
saw
just
that
wondered.
dog as symbolism of hope.
Yeah.
That she was at peace, that she'd found hope. It was an answer to her prayer in some way. I looked at it as the dog representing a hope for out of the horribleness and the awfulness. You can still find hope. You can still find love. You can still find
Or
joy. That's
innocence.
what I took it as. Anybody else? The dog that it
Or
came to the
almost
end.
like an innocence, like a dog, like the dog was just not a human, because the humans were more animalistic than the dog.
Yeah, I saw it. Yeah, it's some sort of a symbol of a sign that um, that from all this ugliness, there's still love, there's still joy, there's still trust, there's still hope. That's the way I read it. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on it. Diane.
I also found the portrayal of race relationships among, I hate to say lower class, but poor people to be pretty accurate and something that doesn't often appear in books, that there was a lot more cooperation and interrelatedness than is generally portrayed. And I thought that was good.
Well, I think that poverty and strife and struggle and hardship has a unifying effect. The things that we all think that are important don't matter. All this identity politics, all that stuff, it doesn't matter because everybody's struggling for survival together. I think that's what that was trying to say. And I have my mother's family is from West Virginia and in some of those areas, and they don't have. She didn't grow up with those kinds of prejudice, if you will, different than what we have in our world, at least today. Carol,
Just wanted to, oh, am I on mute?
you're
No.
on, you're on.
So I just wanted to say that I feel that the book did the job of what a historical fiction book should do on a good note, because I usually don't do this while we're having our meeting, but I found a couple of websites here about Mother Jones. One is a children's picture book that was written, and one is a whole lesson unit on her and the women's movement and the marches and working with children. And my social studies professor hat. I have a huge collection of picture book biographies because I really feel that you need to learn about history by learning about people. And so a young child, like a fourth grader, could learn about her, and I just feel if I'm pressed to look something up, it's like that book we read about the stolen jewels. What was the name of that book that I loved? The one we read about the thieves in London.
Oh, Queens of London.
Yeah, and that really made me really do some investigating beyond just reading the book.
Right.
And I feel that in that way, we could give the author a heads up because it introduced us to the mining plight, the plight of the miners, characters like her that could really lead us to want to learn more about, as one person said, a piece of our history that we knew nothing about. So I think we could give it a positive, and I thank you for deciding to do the book, because even if it was difficult to read, if we came out of it with learning about something that we didn't know anything about, and here we are able to sit and discuss it, I think that's a very positive thing.
Of course. Thanks. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's, it's a different style. Like I said, I knew it was not what we're used to reading, but I thought it was an incredible story that I wanted to share. Janet, you have your hands up.
Just, yeah, I agree with Carol, what she just said about that. I mean, I really did not know anything about minors. I had read, like I said, I had read The Jungle, and that was disgusting enough to learn about abattoirs and all of that kind of stuff. But now I know where the magazine Mother Jones got Mother Jones from, because that must be the connection. I mean, because where else did they get that from? So that's an enlightening thought. And they're still publishing today, which is great. So
Yeah, and the reason why they called her Mother Jones, because she was just such a it says something about her marching with 2,000 women, for the miners. I mean, she really was a powerhouse. And to think about a strong woman like that, I think is good for all of us ladies here and gentlemen.
Well, particularly in that period of time, the 20s,
Right,
or in the
exactly.
teens and before that, right?
And right after the
Um,
war, and that was a really screwed up time anyway, right after the World War I.
Well, and that was another thing I had really not really thought about, was how many of those men who had fought in those horrible conditions during in the Great War, World War I, and had come back to this kind
There.
of treatment, where they're being treated worse.
Yeah.
And it's more dangerous for them in these mines to try to feed their family than it was on the battlefields. And your survival rate in World War I wasn't terribly great in some of these situations. So I found that sad. I also was, I just never realized this, the Lebanese Christians that had come over from the Middle East and settled here in the late 1800s, and ended up in places like Ohio and in West Virginia. And it was just part of, I had no idea. I was shocked by that. I always thought of the folks being in, the people in West Virginia, where a lot of them were, Irish, and they were Scottish, and they were a lot Italians, actually a lot, but just never really thought about it as being from the Middle East. It was something I'd learned that I didn't know. Diane.
Yeah, I appreciated that part. My grandfather was a Greek immigrant who married the woman from Eastern Kentucky. And like I've had friends who were Lebanese and Appalachian, and it's a part of the immigration story that doesn't get told too much,
Right. I was shocked by it. Anybody else besides that? I mean, I was like, I actually looked it up. I was like, wow, I had
Yeah,
no
it
idea.
sets up all these kind of odd acculturations that go on. I mean, you can only imagine. Like my grandfather spoke with a heavy Greek accent, but used Appalachian terms, like naked as a jaybird, and it's fun, you know.
I still say those things. Naked as a jaybird. Tell my kids that
Yeah,
all the
you
time.
just don't have that Greek accent to go with it.
No, Alyssa, I've worked really hard to lose that accent. Tape recorders, and I went to college, and everyone was like, thought I was stupid because I talked like a hick, so I couldn't do that much longer. Nancy.
Following along with I didn't have any idea that there were immigrants that were from Lebanon. But the funny thing for me was, because I listened to it, I kept thinking, what is wrong? I can't understand what he's saying. I couldn't figure out what the word was, because if I'd had the book, I would have looked at the name and Dr. Moo, and I would have understood. But when you're listening to it, I kept thinking, what are they talking about? Who is this guy? What kind of name is this? It took a while for me to put that all together. So, as much as I have to listen to audiobooks right now. Sometimes being able to see something is really helpful.
That's why I have a hard time with audiobooks. If we're in the car going a long way, I can do it. But normally I gotta read it. I gotta see the words, I gotta be able to figure out the words sometimes. It's helpful to me. Um, I'm looking at my list of things, lack of closure, Crockett, future ending. I think that's what I have on my list of things I wanted to bring up. Anybody else want to share any thoughts before we move on and discuss next month? Christine, I know you love the book. Oh, Denise, there's Denise got her hand up.
Well, I just have to say that the longer our conversation has gone on tonight, the more I've enjoyed it. I had a hard time getting into the book, and then I got into the book, and then it ended abruptly. So, but I think the fact that we're all able to discuss a lot of these things is really good, because I knew nothing about this Blair Mountain, and I'm definitely going to look up Mother Jones. And I like that about books too, as somebody else said, anything that will stimulate me or cause me to look deeper. Because, I would call myself a casual reader. I'm not a librarian. I'm not an author. I'm not, I don't know a lot of those things, about books. And so I just thought this was an awesome discussion, and
Well, thanks,
it's good to
Denise.
have them. So
Yeah. And I just noticed I did have one more question for you guys. And that is, and so my husband asked me, and I was like, huh. So he asked me, who is the antagonist in this story? He was like losing. He's like, who's the antagonist? I can't figure it out. And I have the answer, I think, but I'm interested to see if you guys who you think the antagonist is.
I agree with what's in chat. I thought it was King Cole also.
King
Everybody
Cole, right?
King
everybody
Cole.
that was part
Yeah.
of that.
Yeah,
Well,
definitely.
as
They were the main antagonist.
King Cole, or as I called it, the man.
Yeah.
It's the man.
Yeah, it's the man.
It's the proverbial they.
They.
It's the man or the King Cole. Yeah, but I think King Cole is part of it. The man, right? It's King Cole. It's the
machine.
it's the machine. It's the police. It's the corruption. It's the robber barons.
President.
Mansions.
He's even the president in this book. It's the
Yeah.
So yeah, it was an interesting take on that, and because I couldn't keep track of all the bad guys. I mean, there was a bulldog dude, and there was a czar dude. There was a lot of bad guys, but they were all the same
Lump
bad.
them all together.
One big bad man. And interesting. Someone said that Blair Mountain. You talked about Blair Mountain, Denise, and then it ended abruptly. I think another change I would have made. That battle of the Blair Mountain went on way too long. I'm sorry, and then it just, like you said, the army came in and they all just said, "Okay, we're going home." Like, oh, come on, man. I feel like a little more. I really think that Blair Mountain battle was a lot. Um, and I would have liked to seen that a little shorter and then a little more, as Denise said, we needed that trial at the end. So with that, any other comments before I move us on to what we're doing next month? Christine, did you have anything you want to add? I know you really into the story.
I mean, I didn't love everything about similar things that everyone else said, but I liked the fact that I learned something that I had never ever heard about, something that happened on our soil, and that there were heroes and that there were villains. And some of the villains to me should have been unlikely villains. But I don't know.
Well, and if we think about this just for a minute, and we look at it's not just this country, but if we look at what we're doing in Africa and in Indonesia and and China and these mines, and those conditions are just as horrific, and they have children. It's just so very, very sad what we do to for natural resources and the lack of standards, and it's just horrible. And you know it's still going on, so I find it very sad to think about. So I don't want to think about it. Like Miriam says, it's too gray in Ohio. I don't want to. It's gray here too, Miriam. It's gray everywhere except for San Francisco, apparently. All right, so thank you guys for that. I'm gonna stop recording now if I can figure out how to do it. Hold on.